Hi there, this is Frank Winston from the Pacifica Historical Society, host of the show Footprints of Pacifica, where we explore and discover interesting and enlightening facets of the history of our town. The town was incorporated in 1957, and that's what we will focus on tonight, back to November 22, 1957. At that time, we had a activist, Connie Brown, who will be with us tonight, and shortly thereafter, Carl Baldwin moved here to become the city's first city manager, and they will share with us some of their thoughts of how it was then. But interestingly, we have recovered from some archives something that many of you have never seen. That is Movietone News. Think back to 1957. Our news by film or video would only come from the news of the week. Movietone News of the Week, once a week in the movie theater, never in our home television. And so we have a clip from that, and we'd like to show that with you now.
In the Bay region of San Francisco, an addition is being made to the state and nation's geography. Clustered in the area are 7 thriving and attractive communities, each going its own separate community way. Each possesses its own charm. But, say the citizens, in union there is strength, and the town of Pacifica comes into being, over whose city hall the flag is now being raised. Here, 22,000 residents will have their own government, and here their newspaper will be published. Glad tidings indeed. Superior Court Judge Thomas Bocci swears in members of the City Council and Pacifica's new mayor, Mrs. Jean Fassler. Mrs. Fassler is congratulated by Mayor Christopher of San Francisco as she wields the gavel to open her first council meeting. State and nation join the applause for the birth of Pacifica, City of Promise.
Well, this house here was Pacifica's first city hall. It started out in Pacifica at the north end up in Pacific Manor, just to the rear of the Pacifica Fire Station, or the Pacific Manor Fire Station, and it remained there for the first years, and I'm not sure exactly when it was moved to here to Sharp Park, but this is the little building in which we first carried out our city operations. And when I went to work for the city, I encountered our city clerk, Jane Hicks. Our city clerk was actually our first city manager. She was on the job for the first month or so as the city was first put together. The city, in fact, had hired a firm to hire the permanent city manager, and she was here to get the process started. The room to the rear of where she was stationed was the city manager's office, and that was the extent of what we had. We had a mimeograph machine and very little else to work with, a typewriter, of course. And it was on this basis that the city started its operations. One of the people that has been concerned with the city of Pacifica from its very inception, in fact before it was incorporated, was Connie Mason Brown.
In about 1955 or 6, there was a move to incorporate. I understand you took no active role, you and your husband at that time, just was waiting to see how it went.
No, we didn't get involved in that group, but it failed. But they did elect council people, and here they had a city council and no city.
So they were of no power whatsoever. Was there any power here, or what would you consider was the power that ran everything, or did anybody run anything from village to village?
Everything was done in Redwood City. We were kind of an orphan, and that's why we decided we'd like to incorporate, because they had there'd be an accident on the highway, and it took forever for the sheriff's department to show up, and we had no say in taxes or anything else, so it was a good idea to incorporate and run our own city.
Well, this was in 1956. wasn't San Bruno also concerned over whether this would happen?
San Bruno had announced that they were going to annex from San Bruno right over the hill to the ocean, which would have been right past my house. And so we convinced people you didn't want a garbage dump there, and that's what they wanted to do, is have a garbage dump. So
You mean if Pacifica had become part of San Bruno, they were just using it for fill? They weren't concerned about people living here?
right.
Okay. But you mentioned to me that you weren't involved in the original attempt to incorporate, and yet you got very active, and your husband, in the next attempt. What happened in the meantime that prompted you to become sort of an activist?
Well, the merchants in Sharp Park decided they would try incorporation, and they worked on it for a time and found out they couldn't do it. So they had a meeting to try and interest everyone into incorporating, and they decided at that meeting that it was impossible. So they said no, and my husband brought home several men from the meeting, and they argued way late into the night and ended up being told by Gene Tong, who wrote the Little Red Schoolhouse for the Breakers newspaper, because we had 2 newspapers. And he said, people in this city, in this area, will not incorporate until I tell them to, and I'm not going to tell them.
So that gentleman thought he was the power in the town.
Gene Tong, it was his name. And so he and my husband made a bet, a case of I.W. Harper. He said it won't pass, and my husband said, I'll see that it does. So we set up a committee and called them to a meeting at our home. So every night, Sunday night, for 9 months, we met at our home. And then for a couple of months, we had so many people, we finally had to find another place to meet.
When you were holding those meetings here at your home, that gave you a chance to sit in on the conversations.
Well, I was the corresponding secretary, and Lenore Williams was the secretary, took all the minutes, and then we had a group of people, but there were only 2 women on the committee for a time, and so of course I was busy making coffee and serving cookies, but I did all the correspondence.
Was there any thought of why it might pass the second time when they elected a city council but didn't vote in a city the first time, only a year or 2 before?
Well, we had 9 communities, 9 areas. There was Westview, Pacific Manor, Edgemar, Sharp Park, Valamar, Rockaway Beach, Lindamar, Pedro Point, and one more, I guess I missed one, that Pedro Point didn't want to be a part of the city, but we passed it anyway. We got them involved.
Well, it passed by a vote of 2,600 approximately to 2,100, so you had less than 5,000
Yes.
voters at the time. Why did it come back to pass the second time? That anything was happening, or just more people active in your committee?
We just got very involved, and we talked to people. We had meetings and invited people to join us, and everyone says it won't pass, someone else says it's going to pass, and we really held our breath.
I know they gave you the moniker Mother of Pacifica. How did you get people to vote? This is 1957. Television was almost in its infancy. People watched Milton Berle, but they didn't watch politics. How did you get the word out to convince people?
Well, we walked door to door mostly, knocking on doors and talking with people, and it was a very dedicated group that we worked our feet off from door to door.
When we were talking earlier, you mentioned to me that while you had all these planning committee meetings, you had to leave from your house and relocate because you had too many people coming. And there was something about the Masonic Lodge and what occurred there. Could you help us on that?
Yes, well, Mr. Tong was a good friend of a man named John Anscaris. And John was a member of the Masonic Lodge. And he and Gene Tong would go in when they knew we were going to have our meeting, and they would go into one of the rooms next door to the room that we were going to be in and be very quiet, and then they could hear all of the information we had and the plans we had against them, you know, and we found out later, long after we incorporated, that they had done this. Mr. Ansgaris even told me that, my husband and I, that that's what they had done.
The newspaper that we have in Pacifica today, the Pacifica Tribune, you mentioned there was another newspaper then. Did they take a position on the incorporation?
They're the ones that were opposed to it. That's the paper
They
that
led the opposition.
That's the paper that Gene Tong wrote for. It was not called the Pacifica Tribune at that time. I think it was called, oh dear, I think it was called the Comet at one time. Tribune was not called the Tribune until Lowell Blankford bought it.
Did that newspaper exist at this time, and did it take a different position than Gene Tong's paper?
Oh yes.
So then they were on your side?
Sort of.
Sort of.
Yeah. They weren't sure, but they had to be very careful. They didn't want to upset any of the people.
Did anybody come from out of town to start a campaign or to go along with the campaign against incorporation, like either San Bruno and the San Francisco, or anybody saying, boy, it would be bad for us? So it was really the local people that controlled and whatever they wanted from there.
And Lowell Blankford, when he bought the Tribune, what is now the Tribune, was on our side and worked with us on our committee right shortly after incorporation, and was very helpful with things we did. In fact, the night of the election, we found out we had won. And one of the members of our committee had made a coffin about this long and shaped like this down, and had put nails that stuck up this high all around the edge. And our city committee group met over what it was called the Vagabond, and across the road is where the Safeway was built later. And there was a big field there. They had horses and they had piles of hay and so forth. So our committee went over to this field, and we each took a hammer and drove the nails into the coffin and then buried it in a pile of horse manure. We buried Gene Tong. That was the name on the coffin.
Well, your husband had a bet with Gene, and it was a bet for a case of I.W. Harper. Did you collect on the bet, and did you celebrate with the others?
Well, I think Mr. Tong drank a lot of I.W. Harper, because he kept calling and he'd ask me, I'd answer the phone. He'd say, "Is George there?" I'd say, "Yes." He says, "Well, tell him I said hello." And he'd hang up. And he did this 3 times. And then one day he called, it was Christmas time. And I had my Christmas tree up, all decorated. He called and asked for George, and I said, "I'm sorry, he's not here." He says, "I'll be right down." He got a cab. We had a little cab company at that time. Got a cab, came down and knocked on my door, came in carrying this case of I.W. Harper. And I said, "Oh, I'm sorry George isn't here." And he says, "Well, I waited until he wasn't so I didn't want to talk to him." And he had been drinking some of the Harper, I believe, because when he started to leave, he sort of fell and hit my Christmas tree and knocked it down. But he gave me the case of I.W. Harper and paid his debt.
Not long after the city was incorporated and started operating in Pacific Manor, the city was offered cost-free a new city hall, which was the former Sharp Park School. And not long after that, after some extensive renovation, the city moved into that new city hall and began its operations and began really getting down to the business of organizing a new city. Now, Pacifica, of course, started out as a much smaller city. It's estimated that the population then was about 19 or 20,000. Much of this southern area, Lindemar and the back parts, were not even developed. But the several communities, about 8 in number, all came together to make up the new city of Pacifica. And it consisted of the front portion of Lindemar, going some distance back, Pedro Point out here, Rockaway Beach, Valimar, Fairway Park, Sharp Park, and Pacific Manor, and that was and Westview up on top of the hill. These were the 8 communities that started off with coming together to form the city of Pacifica. As it can be seen, Pacifica covers a considerable amount of territory. It's about 6 miles of coastline, for one thing, and it extends back into the valleys and up onto the hills in several places, particularly in Lindemar, Valamar, Rockaway, and at the northern end. So it's a complicated city to serve, and the new city took on a considerable job without actually having very much in the way of resources or economic base. No industry, no major shopping centers, but it was the new city of Pacifica.
Pacifica, city of promise.
Carl and Connie are with us in the studio, and I have to clarify one thing. How many communities? Movie Tone News said 7, Carl said 8, Connie said 9. How many formed Pacifica?
9. Westview, Edgemar, Pacific Manor, Sharp Park, Fairway Park, Valamar, Rockaway Beach, Lindemar, and Pedro Point, who did not want to be included, but we included them anyway.
What brought you to this area at the time in 1953?
Well, the houses they were building were not very expensive. I think we paid $9,500 for a 3-bedroom, 1-bath house. $68 a month payments, and just getting out of law school, that was something we hoped we could afford. And that house, same house, which has had very little work done on it, recently sold for $765,000.
Okay.
Good investment.
Carl, who was Andy Odstad?
Andy Odstad was really the developer of Lindemar. He was working down the peninsula and developing commercial properties down there, and then discovered what is now Pacifica and began the first subdivisions of Lindemar. He was a very successful developer.
And Connie, you bought one of those homes.
I made the first down payment, and I was the 28th family to move in. And the reason I know is because the Golden State milkman knocked on every door and signed customers up to deliver milk. And his name was Bob Pope, and he still lives here in Pacifica.
Now, speaking of the Andy building things, what about the schools when you moved in? Where did kids go to school?
Well, my son had to go by bus to school bus to Sharp Park School. And in 1954, they started building Pedro Valley School. And Andy Odstad was building houses along the property line of the school and decided he would let the school district use 8 of his houses as schoolrooms. He enclosed the bathroom, and everything else was open, no walls. And we had schools that went to Odstad Convertible Schools. We made Life and Time magazine. We were noted all over the country.
Carl, when you moved here, you obviously came for the job. You were doing well in Los Gatos, and you became the city manager. What attracted you to this point?
Well, I had been down in Los Gatos for nearly 5 years as town manager, and this was a good opportunity to move to a city that was just coming into being and had a lot of developmental problems and represented a substantial challenge. And I was very much attracted to the opportunity that Pacifica presented.
I'd like both of you to think back to the early 50s there. What did they have in the way of mail delivery, telephone, transportation, and shopping? Any one of those?
They had no telephones for almost a year in Unit 1. The phone company did put a payphone on the corner of Rosita Road and Rio Vista. The people who lived on that corner would take messages for us if someone did call. And we waited almost a year before we got our telephones.
How about the mail?
Well, by the time of incorporation, the services were pretty well established. So mail services, water from the Special Services District here, and other basic services, including sewage disposal, were operational.
We didn't have mail delivery. We had a building in Sharp Park that was a post office, and we had to go pick up our own mail every day or every couple days. And so the city committee wanted to have mail delivery, and we asked if we could have mail delivered. No, you don't have enough outgoing mail to support it. So the fellows on our committee who worked in the city at Bechtel Corporation and insurance companies and various places would bring home all of the mail from that
company.
business that day, and we would take it to the post office and say, okay, here it is, mail it. And we finally got mail delivery very, very fast.
That's one way to trick them into it. What about the transportation situation? How did people get around, and did they move from each community that was forming?
Well, we did have just one Greyhound service down here, which served along the Coast Highway. But aside from that, there was no municipal transportation at all.
Well, then
there was a taxi service.
How did you get around and your children?
Well, I started the Lindemar column for the Comet newspaper, which was in Sharp Park. And to get information, I had to go drive around the neighborhood and find people working in their yard. And I'd say, oh, have you had any guests, or have you had a birthday party, or what's going on? And that's how we communicated for a long time.
Well, what happened with the transportation, the issue of the other communities? That is, you had 9 now, okay. Did they come together, or did they each want to retain their independence? Socially, did the people start to join clubs that included the whole city, or was it slow to take on in that regard?
Oh, I think it was fast. We did have several fire departments. Pedro Point had a fire truck. Valamar had one, Rockaway Beach, and Sharp Park. There were 4 fire departments that were individual, and when we incorporated, we formed our own fire department shortly after that.
I would say that incorporation brought the communities together, and people who served on various committees and commissions and so forth came from all parts of the city. So this was a unifying influence that the city served as a result of its incorporation.
What about the businesses? What did it attract new businesses, or what did you have in the way of shops?
Well, there was minimal business communities. They were scattered in the various communities, and new businesses were forming. So shortly after incorporation, the first automobile agencies came in, first shopping centers were developed, and furniture stores and other stores, shoe stores, and ladies' dress shops and so forth came into the picture, and incorporation certainly encouraged them. Many of these today we have lost over time, so we were making some gains on it at that time.
How did they get the name Pacifica?
Well, the businessmen in Sharp Park had been trying to incorporate, and they wanted to pick a name for the future city. And Julian Cohen, an attorney, is the one that suggested Pacifica, because that was the big statue that was at
Exposition, the World's Fair.
Yes, the World's Fair.
1939.
And that name was chosen.
Well, it also regards the Pacific Ocean. It means peace. But there was mention quickly of the symbol, the statue. Carl has a statue here. That's what the replica is of what had been coming. Isn't there one in Pacifica, 1 or 2 standing somewhere?
There's one still in existence, and it's right in the middle of the front of the city council chambers in an enclosure. So it is still before the people when they meet with their city council.
Okay, what would you say were the differences of opinion of what kind of businesses should be here? Because I understand that the automobile dealership, you wanted them, and then people didn't want them. You had no tax base. Tell us how you raised money. Later, how you raised money to get on the ballot. But how did the city raise taxes to produce anything?
Right. Well, the city incorporated, and at that time, there were no major shopping centers, no regional shopping centers then or today. And likewise, there was no industry and no prospect probably for industry ever coming to Pacifica. So the city had to start out with a very minimal economic base, and it has been struggling ever since. because of the need for additional commercial development, and it's still struggling. It hasn't changed.
Connie, how about the social organizations? What kind? You mentioned, I think you mentioned the PTA you were part of, the Kiwanis and Rotary, I believe,
Well,
started off.
not right away. We
Okay.
had PTA meetings. We had not council meetings. We had homeowners associations, and then eventually we had Junior Kiwanis, I believe it was called.
The Junior Chamber of
Junior
Commerce.
Chamber,
Right.
Junior Chamber, and then the Lions Club, and gradually started building organizations.
Carl, what would you say were the most significant improvements in the first 2 or 3 years?
Well, the first couple of years, I guess, bring into being all of the municipal services. When we became incorporated, why the fire services had to consolidate, and likewise public works and so forth. And
Okay, Carl, I'm getting a signal we're out of time. I can't go any further on that. But we've had with us Carl Baldwin, the first city manager of Pacifica, Connie Brown, who was an activist for the formation of the city. And this has been brought to you by the Pacifica Historical Society. And we'd ask you, if you know of anything that would be a replica or a memorabilia or letters, photographs, please contact us, send them in. The bar below will show where you can get in touch with us. And remember, lives of great men all remind us we can make our lives sublime. And departing, leave behind us footprints in the sands of time.